Well, welcome everyone. This is Greg Rock with BPM Institute, and we're thrilled to welcome everybody to our Business Process Management virtual group meeting. We're lucky enough today to have Lisa Hershman with us, who's the CEO of Hammer & Company, and we're going to be talking about Lisa's recently released book co-authored with Michael Hammer, and we're thrilled that we can make this part of our series, and that Lisa's going to present some of the excerpts and talk about a lot of the major concepts for the book. And Lisa has also been gracious enough to make herself available for a Q&A. You'll notice that the phone lines are muted for today, but we do have a Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to submit your questions at any point in time during today's meeting, and we're going to try our best to answer each and every one of those. But first, I'd like to just give a little context to these virtual group meetings. I know we have a lot of familiar faces on the phone line and logged in, and we also have some new folks as well. And so quickly, let me orient you to what these virtual group meetings are, the format, and then we'll get right into the focus of today's session. So today's meeting is actually being hosted by BrainstormCentral.org, and this is the members-only social network that serves our three communities: BPMInstitute.org, BusinessArchitectureInstitute.org, and SOAInstitute.org. And this is a practitioner-led community. There's a lot of discussion threads, blogs, wikis, and groups forming there, focused both topically, vertical industry-wise, and even role-based. And it's a great place to be able to collaborate, educate, and innovate with other practitioners like yourself, both globally and locally. We have 45 groups that have grown up organically on Brainstorm Central. They are topical groups, vertical industry groups. So we even have groups that are forming on a geo basis along the lines of virtual local chapters. This virtual group meeting is a series of webcasts that we're doing to promote the different groups and the different activities that are happening on Brainstorm Central. The community and the content are being driven by requests from our members, and this year especially there seems to be a landslide of new thinking around process, a lot of great new books that have been released, and Faster, Cheaper, Better would be amongst that list. And so that's why we've decided to kick off these virtual group meetings with a series of Meet the Authors. And we're going to have today's session led by Lisa Hershman. And we've had some previous sessions that you'll find archived recordings on the website from Andrew Spanny and also William Ulrich. Just a couple tips on how to get going on Brainstorm Central. If you have a current membership on any of the three institutes, the same username and password will make you available to participate there. And it gives you the opportunity to fill in a profile, upload a portfolio. You also have the ability to search for other practitioners like yourselves through the People Map, which will identify 200 of the closest members that match your profile and interests. You're able to look folks up by role, by industry, and by interests. And you also can do geo-searching as well to see who else is, well, how many other process-minded folks are in my state, my town, or what have you. You have the ability to reach out and communicate to those folks through the platform while retaining privacy of email and other critical contact data. And we have a lot of different BPM-specific activities, as you would imagine, on Brainstorm Central, including a very active group with a lot of discussions, information around our BPM Certificate of Training program, and obviously folks can also subscribe to our BPM bulletin that's available through the main website. And so without further delay, I want to introduce today's speaker. And we're thrilled to have Lisa Hershman with us, the CEO of Hammer & Company. And the book that has just been released is Faster, Cheaper, Better, and the 9 Levers for Transforming How Work Gets Done. And what we particularly like about the approach that was taken in the book, which matches our own philosophy, is really talking about how actual practitioners have done this in case studies. And there's some great analysis on what folks at the U.S. Air Force, Clorox, Fidelity Investments, and more have done around process thinking. And so Lisa comes to us as the CEO of Hammer & Company with a lot of industry experience. Previously, she served as a corporate senior vice president of operational excellence at Avnet. She was honored there with the Avnet Corporate Chairman's Award. And her career experience also includes work at GE Aerospace and is currently a contributing columnist for Business Week. And so, Lisa, thank you very much. I'm going to hand things over to you at this point.
Great, Greg. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for dialing in. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Just by way of background a little bit, let me explain how we got here. So many of you probably have heard of Dr. Michael Hammer, seen truly as the thought leader and a bit of the godfather around end-to-end process thinking, and that's going to be a big part of the focus and why end-to-end is so important. But just by way of a little more context for you, his greatest book, which he co-authored with Jim Champy, was called Re-Engineering the Corporation. Came out years ago and was actually seen as one of the 10 best business books of all time. And I had the wonderful pleasure when I was, like many of you, a practitioner. I tell people I come by this honestly. And when I was working in Avnet, my last company, were very large, $22 billion B2B in the electronics space. We were located in 72 countries, and my task was to implement end-to-end process globally. So I looked at who was the expert in this space, Dr. Michael Hammer, and I took many of his all of his courses actually, and we started to collaborate. He was studying what I was doing on a global basis because few had done it on that large of a scale. And then, of course, I would tap into some of his research and so forth for benchmarking. And we started actually to collaborate on the book Faster, Cheaper, Better. For those of you who don't know, and very sadly, in September of 2008, Dr. Hammer very unexpectedly passed away. And I have the absolute honor and privilege to have been named his successor, and it was a labor of love to complete the book that had been started, and we're delighted to have it published just about 6 months ago at the end of December. And we've gotten a lot of great feedback from people, because one of the things we felt was important was to, as Greg said, not only point out some of the case studies and the positive things that people have been able to do. And we have a rich database of research. We've had the fortune to work with over 75% of the Fortune 100 companies, which is why my job's so fun. We work with everyone, as Greg mentioned, from the Air Force to Clorox, but we also work with folks like Cirque du Soleil and the Church of Latter-day Saints. So it's always something different. But what's great is every organization has processes, and so there's something relatable in the book for everyone. The other thing we did was we added what not to do, and certainly we protected the names of companies who were kind enough to share their stories, because they said, we want people to learn from our mistakes. We don't necessarily want to advertise who made them, however. So there are do's and don'ts in each chapter of the book that will hopefully help you to avoid some of the same pitfalls as many companies have run into. And what's different about the way we talk about process and end-to-end and enterprise thinking is along the lines of, and every time I do a class, I tell people, I want you to be passionate about process, but I don't want you to be a process zealot, because in business, when there are zealots, you all know, I grew up in the quality world in GE Aerospace, and if you're only talking defects per million, et cetera, they tune out. And so relating this to business results, customers' results, and your business strategy is really important. So that's why I looked at the list of attendees, and it's impressive, and I'm excited to tell you all, or to be with you all today. What I want to start with is on the first slide there is a story of Bob, and we opened the book with the same story. It sort of depicts how many organizations, whether public sector, private sector, large or small, seem to work. And it's actually a story that Dr. Hammer shared with me. And he said that he was going into a company, and they were very excited that he was visiting. And the CEO of the company met Dr. Hammer at the door, and they said, Dr. Hammer, we're so excited you're going to be here with us today. We have a wonderful day planned for you. We're going to start with a plant tour and give you some overview of the remarkable things that we've been able to accomplish. But first of all, we want to introduce you to Bob. Bob is our Employee of the Year. You see, we were bringing on a brand new customer, and it meant an enormous amount of new business for us. And Bob, it was critical that we got the first shipments right. And Bob was home in bed one night, and he realized that he had forgotten some paperwork that was supposed to go with the critical first shipment. And he jumped out of bed and jumped in his car and drove to the plant. He forgot his badge, so he climbed the fence and he broke in the back door, and he found the error, and he fixed the error before the shipment went out. And Bob is our Employee of the Month because of the great job that he had done. And Dr. Hammer turned to Bob, shook his hand, and said, it's a pleasure to meet you. He turned back to the CEO and said, congratulations, your processes must be garbage. And the point was that so often performance in our organizations is as a result of heroes, people who are forced to overcome bad processes in order to get things done right, either for the business, for the customer, or for both. And what we talk about in all of our classes is that we want to eliminate the need for heroes, and instead we want to focus on end-to-end work, what we call enterprise process, that links much of the organizations and the departments within an organization so that we don't have to rely on heroes. I'll tell you another side story of my own experience when I was working for GE Aerospace. I had the pleasure of learning to do quality audits with the Naval Warfare Assessment Center. And as they were training me, they said, you really can tell whether or not an organization's processes are in good shape by asking for one piece of paper. And that piece of paper is the organizational chart, and there's one title or job function that will give you the best indication as to whether their processes are broken. And that's the job title of expediter. Because they said if someone has, he said many times there are entire departments that are dedicated to expediting. And if you know that they've got an entire department that is dedicated to getting around the processes, and they spend their career doing this, you know that they've got something wrong. And so that's something that we used at GE to tell at a thumbnail glance as to whether process was alive and well or if it was just a rumor. So we talk about process from an end-to-end perspective in terms of across functions and across silos. And we're also talking about a group of related tasks that work together to create a result of value to customers. And we use terms like voice of the customer and voice of the business because you want to take the value that you're providing to the customer, but obviously we're all in business for a reason. We have to balance it with the needs of the business. Now, oftentimes when I talk to organizations or we're doing public addresses and keynotes and so forth, I ask people what's their first impression when they hear the word process. And many times they confuse process with procedure. And when they hear the term procedure, they think, oh no, you're going to come in and tell me how to run my business, and not going to be able to take decision making, and I've got to follow work instructions, etc. And many other times we hear, I don't have time for this, and if I focus on all this process stuff, we're not going to have any time to pay attention to the customer, and it's going to create a bureaucracy and waste a lot of time and money. Actually, it couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, the truth about process is that it's focuses attention on clients and focuses on results. And when we say results, a lot of organizations do a great job of having department goals and measuring department or functional results. We're talking about the end result and not getting so mired or caught up in the department results along the way. What's really important is those end results. And if you think about designing your work to meet those end results, you get an entirely different perspective. It actually reduces overhead. For many of you might be familiar with terms like value add and non-value add, business enabling, waste. And we certainly want to keep the value add. That's what the customer will pay for. But the non-value add, we say from the customer standpoint, we also call it business enabling. Many times we find that a lot of additional steps and work gets caught up there because we feel we have to do it this way or we've always done it this way. And then, of course, there's waste, and that's where the output is not necessarily used as an input for anyone. And so it reduces that waste and thereby overhead. Actually, it increases or improves flexibility or agility, because what we talk about is reducing people working from one task and handing off to another to do another task. And we talk in terms of designing for sub-processes so that there's actually more flexibility and more decision-making. We have on the slide there a great quote that's from one of our clients that says, a CEO was talking about becoming a process organization, and his engineering group said, well, we're sort of the creative side of the business, so I'm sure that doesn't pertain to us because we need to be creative. And he says, I want you to be creative about the product, not about the process. Actually, he said, I want you to be creative about the product, not what you're going to do Wednesday. And the message was that we can innovate through our products or our services, and there is, through the design process, a way to innovate your ability to deliver. But if you're not consistent all the time, and the customer can't rely on what you're going to be delivering, then it creates issues and customer dissatisfaction. So the truth about process is that many of the assumptions, actually process can overcome those assumptions. So if you look at the next slide, we have the chain of value. And if you actually start at the bottom where you have a process enterprise that can drive process behavior, that in turn creates high-performance processes, which leads to the results for the customer and for the business, and that gives you enterprise success. So we see this as a chain of value. And by the way, we use this in conjunction with many, many good tools like Six Sigma, like Lean. Unfortunately, in most organizations, they're not appropriately applied. You have one department that will grab onto a technique or a tool and they say, yes, we're going to do this. And unfortunately, they end up making things better in their own department. But when you look from an enterprise standpoint, those improvements get lost because it wasn't something that reached across all of the boundaries. So when we advocate talking about the entire enterprise and people thinking about their work and managing their work and performing their work in a different way. Surprisingly, many times when folks attend our classes, I'll get the inevitable question that says, well, should we change the organizational chart and organize by process? And actually, the answer is no. If you think of it in terms of organizing by functions, but managing by process, that truly gives the integration and alignment that most organizations are lacking but are trying to accomplish. And we think process is that thread that will bring them together. So just to give you an example, and when this is done right, and you can truly do this across functions and across departments, the type of results that you can achieve can be just insurmountable, transformational. We tell people if you do this right, you're not looking at a 3 to 4% increase. We're looking at double digits. What you see on the slide in front of you is that on average, from all of the work we've done with many organizations, these are the numbers or the ranges that we see on average. From an order fulfillment process, we see perfect orders improved by 25%. Cycle time reduction from 60 to 90%. Lead time reduction over 75%. Those are not small numbers. And if you look at procurement, transaction cost reduction of 80 to 90%, cycle time reduction 85%, employee satisfaction increasing by 100%, and that's on average. And we get often people say, well, how can that possibly happen? And what's interesting is when we go to companies and we talk to the workers and we say, who's your customer? They don't always know. And many times we get the response that my boss is my customer because they're the one who sets my targets, determines my performance, sets my pay scale, etc. And they don't even know how their work adds value to the end result. So when you're looking at things end to end and you're focused on that end result, you get people aligned around the end result, and therefore it creates line of sight. And people now can relate their contribution and their work to that end result. And we see business improvements, huge improvements in customer satisfaction, but also that employee satisfaction increase as well. Moving on to the next slide, we also see in creative processes such as product development, cycle time improvements 50 to 75%, success ratio increases of 30 to 50%, an increase in new product revenue share of 50 to 100%. These are attention-getting numbers that truly translate to bottom-line results. In customer service, first call resolution increases of 100 to 1,000%. Problem resolution cycle time decreased by 50%. Repeat problem call reduction of 30%. And it's a combination of things, not only the design of the work, but it's also things like the measurement of the work. For instance, in customer service, that first call resolution, we find that in many customer service centers or call centers, their metrics are all wrong. Too often we've seen number of calls per day is how someone in customer service is measured. But truly, we really don't, if you're not careful, that can drive behavior actually counter to what you want. First call resolution, if the customer calls in and gets their problem resolved the first time they call, that's not only an efficiency factor for the business, but it's also something that leads to greater customer satisfaction. So these numbers create customer sat improvements, revenue growth. We see increase in market share, improvement on return on assets, cost reductions, net present value numbers. All we have seen affected to the positive as a result of looking at process across your enterprise. Many times people say, well, we're really here because of the economy, we need to reduce costs. But you can't just cut your way to prosperity. You have to, in this constantly changing global world that we live in, we have to be nimble. And if you don't have the right processes, just being able to react to events, you think about what happened in Japan and the number of suppliers that were unable to deliver because of the disaster in Japan. How well did organizations respond to that, and were they nimble? And cost reduction is a piece of it and an important piece, but it's also so much more that can be accomplished when looking across your enterprise. So it is critical because it allows you to change faster than the competition. We have many of our clients that you can read about in the book that have no problem with us telling their story because they're such a process focused and centric organization that they're innovating constantly, and even if their competition reads about what they're doing, they're on to the next thing by the time the competition catches up to them. We also have clients who won't allow us to use their name because they see this as the silver bullet, if you will, that makes them much more agile and responsive in the marketplace, and they don't want their competition to know about it. So one of the things that we've done, and it's a large premise of what Faster, Cheaper, Better is about, is through many, many years of research, we looked at what are the commonalities and the best practices around organizations that are very successful with implementing process. And we came up with a framework. And what you see on the screen there, it's PEM. It stands for Process and Enterprise Maturity Model. And it gives you a 4-level model of maturity and also 9 elements, and the book calls them in the subtitle the levers, that need to be addressed in order to be a process-managed organization. You know, so many times when I talk to folks about process, they think about flow charts. And certainly the design is a big part of that, but it's so much more. In fact, we've broken those 9 levers into 2 categories. One are the process enablers, and we'll go through each of those, and also the enterprise capabilities. And the reason we've broken them down is because process is helpful in obtaining results, but processes have to live in a hospitable environment, and creating that hospitable environment in the enterprise helps you sustain the results. And if you do process in response to a crisis and you don't change your enterprise to support it, it will be short-lived and you won't realize and sustain over the long term those great results that we talked about just a few slides earlier. Let me speak for a moment about the process enablers, and there are 5. The first one is design, and that is how the steps work together and are linked and maybe performed in parallel, and is the sequencing right, and so forth. We actually teach a 4-day class on how to do process redesign and re-engineering, and it gets into even doing pilots and tests and so forth. But how do you design for specific customer and business results? And then once you have that design, how do the people working in the process, how does their job change? And we call those folks performers. And oftentimes they move from being task masters and just managing and performing tasks to managing sub-processes. And so what needs to happen with their skills, knowledge, et cetera, and how do they work differently? We also talk about having a process owner. And there are multiple levels of ownership that can be put in place, but the important one is having someone at a senior leadership level who has the responsibility for the process and the results of the process. We also address infrastructure. That means that when the performers' jobs have changed, what needs to change to support them? Their career development, their measurement system, their compensation system, and also from an IT perspective, what technology do they need? What information do they need and at what time, and how does that infrastructure best support them? And then finally, it's one of my personal favorites is talking about metrics. And the reason it's a personal favorite is because I find that we, in most organizations, are data rich but information poor. We have a tendency to look at metrics from the standpoint of what will the system generate for us and what information is easily accessible, but not necessarily what's the right information. I see organizations that select metrics that actually drive behaviors counter to what performance you want. And one of my favorite examples, if you think about the insurance business, You have an organization in insurance companies called sales, and they want to sign up just about everybody. But then you've got an organization called underwriting, and they're trying to manage and reduce risk. So they are very careful about who they sign up in a little tongue-in-cheek fashion. They want to sign up no one. So you think about if your sales organization is measured on signing up as many people as they can, but you've got an underwriting organization who's measured on signing up only those that present the lowest risk, you ask yourself, how are we ever going to achieve business results when you have two dramatically opposing ways of driving behavior and measuring people? And that's why looking at end-to-end metrics is a big part of what we talk about and what we've written about in the book. The next section, as I mentioned, are the enterprise capabilities, and that starts with leadership. And what we find is becoming a process organization may start either at the top, in the middle, from the ground up, but it can't sustain unless you've got executive buy-in. Because again, this relates to the strategy, the business results, and it also requires commitment. If you're going to have folks working on the process design, you need to have, some of the best and the brightest and cross-functionally represented working on the design team, and it requires often some investment in new technology from an IT perspective, as long as you do process first. So having that leadership talk about process, who understands it and supports it, is really critical. In fact, I'll give you some data. Is we see that the number one reason that process initiatives that are cross-functional fail is because of the lack of leadership. And if you look at our maturity model, that's the entire model is in the back, printed in the back of the book, it shows that at a minimum, to be at a level 1, you have to have at least one leader. But as you move up to level 3 and 4 maturity, many more leaders within the organization not only understand but support process and live by it through their own measures and even compensation. In fact, we write entire 2 chapters dedicated to 2 companies, Quaker Gamesa, located in Monterrey, Mexico, and Tetrapack, who's located in Lund, Sweden, who have really been doing this and running their businesses for a long time, in excess of 10 years, as the beacons of how to do this right. And you'll read in there about how instrumental and significant senior leadership was. The next is culture. One of my favorite questions in classes is I ask, which of the 4, what's the hardest? And inevitably everyone says culture. And I said, actually, no, culture takes the longest to change. Leadership is the most difficult. Because if you think about it, culture is nothing more than the byproduct of your leadership. And if any time, I'll use Avnet as an example, my last company, it was very interesting when you meet the people at Avnet, and they're lovely people, they shake your hand. It seems very formal. And I found this coming from GE, which, our culture in aerospace was not that way. I found it rather interesting that people would shake hands so frequently. And after I got to know the organization, and I looked at the very top, 8 out of the 10 senior-most leaders had sales experience. And so that culture of shaking hands and formality and greeting people and so forth came from the influence of so many of the senior leaders having that sales background. So when you think about your culture, think about how it's a reflection from your leadership. And if any of you have had a change in leadership, how does the culture take some time, but eventually the culture then starts to reflect the new leadership style. We also talk about the need for expertise, and those are folks that have skills in and a methodology for process and process redesign. And then finally, governance. How do you manage all of the initiatives and the redesign and the impact of business and the funding, and many of our sophisticated clients who do this well even reallocate budgets by process and process owners and so forth. But you need a governance structure or that mechanism for managing how all the initiatives work together. By the way, for any of you who are considering embarking on a process redesign, one thing to keep in mind is you want to design end-to-end, but you want to implement in waves, because if you design end-to-end and try to implement on the entire end-to-end process, it could be incredibly crippling to the organization and your customers. And that's why it's important that the governance structure is in place to manage the implementation of those waves. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about Gamesa. They are, as I mentioned, they're located in Monterrey, Mexico. They make cookies and biscuits. They're a division of PepsiCo. And they were the market share leader in biscuits, but they had some real issues with performance. Cycle time was an issue. They had some quality issues, and they started to see that they were losing some of their market share to competitors. So they decided that taking on a process-based transformation was the way to not only get over some of the issues they were having, but take their organization as a whole to the next level. So they created something we call an enterprise process model that explains their organization in process terms. And they have product development, order to cash, and then some manufacturing processes. So they worked in teams and designed their processes to work in teams. Team members were given actually more authority around process performance, determining the indicators of performance, and they were also given the responsibility for training and human capital management. So if somebody was going to be out on vacation, it wasn't the boss that was necessarily making the decisions, it was the team members themselves. So it was that transfer of ownership and responsibility in managing these processes and sub-processes that went to the team. The managers then had a shift in their role, and they became more along the lines of a coaching role. So they were providing training, skills training, development, feedback, motivation. They had input to performance. And what was interesting is the self-directed work teams became so strong that the number of managers that they needed had gone from 12-to-1 to a 55-to-1 ratio. And I will mention here, and if you read the book, it's in there as well, when they rolled out this process-based organization, not everyone was entirely excited about it. And so they actually lost many managers that said, this is not for me. But the ones that stayed started to really thrive in the role of a coach because they weren't caught up in the day-to-day. They were actually in a more strategic role, and the self-directed work teams really started to take on a lot of that day-to-day management. So the teams came to leadership and they said, we would like to, when we see the process results, we would like to be measured on those results. And leadership said, that sounds fair. And they have a union workforce. They went from 100% base pay. They are now working at a 100% variable pay system, no base pay. And they are paid solely on process performance. Their plant sells output at a price based on quality, service, and cost. And so that's the combination of how the factors that they use for measurement. And the sales income is divided among team members based on the job type. So the improvements were huge. Volume increased by 50%. They reduced labor costs by 12%. Yields increased 15 points. Quality nearly doubled. The wages, the average worker was making 92 pesos per day. They are now making about 220 pesos per day. It was just a game-changing transformation in this organization. And you see on the slide the story of Juanito. One of their the inspiration for much of this was when their CEO started thinking to himself, when things weren't going so well, how did we get in this position? And they realized that they lost sight of the customer. And as he was coming into work one day, he saw a small boy sitting on the curb eating some of their cookies. And he went over to the boy and he said, "What is your name?" And this young man said, "I'm Juanito." And Juanito became the symbol for every decision that Gamesa would make. They would ask themselves, what would Juanito think? It was a really charming story, a true story. This young man became such a symbol for the new direction of this company. He's now a grown man, has been through college already, and is still quite a celebrity at Quaker Gamesa. And if you walk into their headquarters, in the lobby is a bronze statue of Juanito sitting on the curb, because they tell their employees, we never want to lose sight again of our customer and what's important to them. So it was a truly wonderful story that is still such an important fabric of their culture. Their leadership, again, took hold of this and shaped the culture accordingly. Our other case study in the book is, as I mentioned, Tetrapack. If you're not familiar with them, they're based I said Sweden before, Switzerland. They've got, they make juice boxes. They make the equipment that makes the juice boxes, and they also provide the materials. So they have 3 order fulfillment processes. They had it's a family-owned business. It grew rather quickly over time. After about 25 years of a rough start, it suddenly started to grow very quickly, but they also, once they were growing very quickly, they found that they could not keep up with customer demand and quality, and they started to show symptoms of customers going to competition. Their market share started to drop, getting customer complaints. People were saying, you know what, you're hard to do business with. Many of you may have heard that term, easy to do business with. You know, if you like the product, but it's a hassle to do business with you, you're also going to lose clients to your competitors, and that's what Tetrapack started to see. So they decided to focus on product development and product launch. They looked at their engineering maintenance schedules and looked at their supply chain process, implemented a process management system, and they've been able to improve perfect orders by 50% and also cut their inventory in half. So think about providing the right product at the right time at the quoted price with the right quality and still be able to cut your inventory in half. That says that you're a very agile organization. They have been doing this for, I believe it's now about 12 years, and still at the very top, at the CEO level, are still running their business today by process. Greg mentioned in the introduction our work with the U.S. Air Force. Great organization. They, one of the stories that we tell is that they had individuals that were trying to access training that was very important and critical to their mission. But the application and approval process and registration for this training was 6 weeks. And by focusing on what the right steps and the necessary steps were and changing their measurements, they are now able to complete and register and have approved training in 1 day. You think about our armed forces. You want them to have that necessary training and not have to wait 6 weeks to get registered and approved. Another example is Clorox. They had some major delivery issues, and they had some real cost issues too. And their leadership was the one who drove a lot of the process thinking and spearheaded the effort for design. And they were able to, they created a whole new measure called perfect order for them. They saw those perfect orders increase 300% while they were also while they also cut costs. They also, from a green cleaning products, they became so agile and had a better innovation pipeline. They really captured the market for green cleaning products. So it's a great story. And then Fidelity Investments, they invested in process by giving customer service reps more responsibility and more authority to make decisions on behalf of the customer, and then they changed their measures accordingly. Now, when I say change measures, I'm not just talking about just their measures and goals they're trying to hit. They also changed compensation. And we see a critical turning point in sustainment of process management when you actually, once you test the measures and they're giving you the results that you want, then to change people's and align people's compensation accordingly, then you've got a better chance at sustainment. They were able to realize higher profits and much higher customer loyalty as a result of their efforts. So, I know I want to make sure that we leave time for questions and so forth, but there are so many stories, and I will tell you that we get a lot of folks who say, I'm in a sales department and process really doesn't pertain to me, or I'm in a creative creative department, process doesn't pertain to me. But process works in any organization. If you don't even realize it, we have processes at home that we use all the time. And process is a huge part of the way we should be conducting ourselves in business. And as we saw from many of the examples, there are huge game-changing results that can be realized. But the key is, and the significance, and why Dr. Hammer and I felt it was so important to publish the book, is because it's too many times people try to overcome an issue or a crisis by simply sometimes just changing the org chart. It always amazes me when the economy starts to go south and the first thing they do is start to lay people off. And while that may make an immediate hit to the bottom line, you're asking, too often we don't change the work. We just change the number of people who are doing the work. But the work is supposed to get done. The results are supposed to be at least maintained, if not improved. And we want fewer people to do the same work. And we have a tendency to cut training budgets, so we don't even give them the skills to get it done. None of that makes sense to me. And so if you really want to become more agile, we've got to get rid of some of the crazy work that we're doing just because we've always done it, re-examine what we're doing, focus on end results and not get so caught up in what this department and that department is doing, and change more than just the organizational chart. Or another thing that people do is they'll flow chart everything out and they'll change the boxes on the flow charts, but they don't change the measurements or the way people work or anything that goes with it. And that's why it was so important for us and folks at Hammer and Company to publish this, because if you pick one or two elements, you might get some results, but they would be incremental at best. If you want the game-changing, transformational, and again, business results that impact that bottom line, help you grow market share by becoming more agile and easier to do business with, then you've got to look at all 9 elements. And looking at process from an end-to-end standpoint is the only way you're going to have this kind of transformational change. And certainly there's a lot of great tools, as I mentioned. So we're big advocates for using within a process-managed organization, balanced scorecards, Six Sigma, Lean. They all have a place. But remember, these are toolkits. These are tools in a toolkit that we see many organizations that grab one tool and they try to use it for every issue and in every situation, and when it doesn't work out, they blame the tool. And we say, no, if you don't have a process that, if you're never meeting your goals or not hitting your goals, your process isn't capable. It begs for redesign. You can improve execution all day long, but if you don't use the right tool for the right problem, you're never going to get those game-changing results that you want and need and deserve through the work through a process-based organization. So I could go on all day. There are so many examples that we have in the book, and everything from public to private industry. I've been talking a lot recently on the woes of the U.S. Postal Service and how they could be better served by looking at our neighbors to the north in Canada and some of the great things they've done. So it can apply to any type of industry, and it doesn't have to be necessarily 9, 12 plus months of work. The Canadian Postal Service did some great things where they saw long lines, and people were getting frustrated waiting in long lines at the post office, and natural reaction is to throw more people to serve the customers. And they said, you know what, let's use some of our proven tools like root cause analysis. And they found that, and I think we can all relate, when you go in the post office, you see levels of service such as express and priority, and we don't always know the difference. And the same thing was happening to them when they'd stand in line for a long time and then go up to the counter and ask, what's the difference between express and priority? They found it was a huge issue. So they simply changed their signs, and they made a common language to the customer. And now their signs read, got time, running late, or in a panic. And the simplicity of changing to the customer's language rather than forcing the customer to speak their language was able to improve customer satisfaction by over 65%. I mean, and yes, they did some redesign and they changed their metrics too, but they were able to accomplish some extraordinary things through some pretty interesting and rather simple techniques, but they would have never gotten there unless they were looking at their process from an end-to-end standpoint. So it's, like I said, we have Hammer & Company does public courses. We have a mastery curriculum based on redesign techniques, how to manage and implement process in your organization. We also have a research consortium where we keep the research fresh and moving in new directions, and we're already working on some game-changing research around implementation and metrics and leadership too. So, Greg, I want to make sure that I leave some time for folks' questions and so forth. And
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Appreciate you exposing our members to some of the key concepts at Hammer & Company and some of the things that they can look forward to in the book. I've got 2 housekeeping items, things that we promised folks. If you notice down on the bottom left-hand corner, there is a file download box with a free excerpts from the book. A lot of our authors that come on will make a chapter of their book available to our members. And what I like about what Lisa and the folks at Hammer & Company have made available is their different chapter excerpts that are part of that attachment that take you through many of the different sections and chapters of the book. And so that was part of our promise for folks registering and attending, so I'd encourage you to do that now. The second housekeeping item is folks were asking me if this presentation will be available afterwards, and both the slide deck and this recorded webcast will be posted on bpminstitute.org, available starting on Monday. And so we have a few minutes left to go, and we want to try to get through as many questions as possible. Folks may be ending their day a little bit in a few hours, but a couple quick takeaways from this meeting. We would encourage you, if you like what you've heard today and would like to continue the dialogue, create a profile on brainstormcentral.org, join the BPM group or some of the other discussions we have going, and participate, and you can start networking. And then some upcoming things that we have taking place are, of course, our online training sessions, our face-to-face events. Our next event will be on the West Coast, San Francisco, at the end of June. And we have an upcoming group meeting that's going to feature Andrew Guarte from Wells Fargo. And so we encourage folks to join Brainstorm Central and participate there. And so, Lisa, before we let you run, let's see if we can get through a couple questions.
Sure.
The first one, I'm going to read between the lines here a little bit, but Jeff was commenting that some of the topics and things that we were talking about sounded like lean. And so maybe if I could ask you to give us Hammer & Company's position on the difference between BPM as a discipline and the different methodologies that folks may use.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and we are huge advocates of using lean in conjunction with a BPM strategy, especially when you're working on your redesign. And we have a redesign methodology that lean fits into. That, you know, sometimes these redesigns, when you're looking at process end to end, it can be rather complex. And one thing we encourage people is that if you've got leadership buy-in, but you go away for 9 months or 12 months and nobody hears anything from you, you're doomed. And so what we say is, you know, looking at the processes, look for opportunities for waste, and using lean and lean techniques are a great way to get that momentum going, some quick hits. It also can be a very highly engaging tool if used effectively. We also like, and I've seen it used very effectively, is a modification of the value stream map and value and having all of the processes in one place. That we've seen folks build dashboards around that. It's very effective for a process owner. And the process owner role has the authority for the design, while the functional managers they manage the implementation. And so, and the thing with lean, and I'll actually put Six Sigma in there too, is they are great tools that we have seen badly misused because, as I mentioned earlier, usually one department grabs onto it. And so we see them as great adjuncts into helping with execution and flow and you know, waste removal and so forth as part of the bigger strategic business process management. We see end-to-end process as a bit of the umbrella, if you will, with the tools that support it underneath.
All right, great. We certainly get a lot of questions around methodologies that folks can use, and as I think you put it, hit the hammer, or hit the nail right on the head, Lisa, when you said it's really different weapons in the toolbox.
Yeah.
You know, it's not one that's going to solve all your problems, but folks can borrow from different bits of methodologies. And within our own curriculum, we've even built out a training course that we've done with Michael Melanowski and Tom Dwyer around understanding what the available methodologies are and which are best for certain scenarios. But let's see if we can squeeze a couple more questions in before we run out of time. I want to be respectful of our 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock time frame. So Jerry from California has asked that he likes the idea of enterprise-wide processes, but typically sees the process focus start out within a department. And the top-down initiation of process focus based on enterprise-wide definition is the exception. Or is he wrong? So are you more likely to see these isolated pockets bubbling up, or are we starting to see a trend of more tops-down endorsement?
Actually, and it's a great question. Fortunately, we are starting to see the trend reverse. We're getting more top leaders, CEOs, CFOs from companies coming to the classes looking for a way to better execute their strategy. And once they get it, that we're seeing them take the leadership to more cross-functional. Now, it isn't always perfect, but even if you can get across, say, 3 departments, that's much better than isolating it within one. You're right, though, and again, it's with these wonderful tools like Lean and Six Sigma that we're only departments, but we are seeing a much improved trend to senior leaders seeing it from an end-to-end enterprise standpoint.
All right, great. Thank you, Lee. And Lisa, let me see if we can get to one more. Question from Bridget is, what's your view of organizations that deploy ERP systems with predefined processes and then try to force the organization to adopt those?
Well, it's a great question. In one word, tragic. In fact, we had a client that did this. They didn't spend any time designing the processes to meet their business, and they ended up wasting so much money on an ERP implementation because 6 months after implementation, people were so uncomfortable working in the new tool because it wasn't familiar that they were spending overtime going back and recreating their work in the old way of doing things because they were afraid it wasn't right. It was so foreign. Process has to come before technology.
All right, great, Lisa. And I think the last question that we'll end the day with is, we were talking about titles earlier on, and you were talking about expediters, and some folks may not be aware that the term business process owners was actually invented by Michael Hammer and Hammer and Company.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, are you seeing any emergence of a senior level title, either expressly named Chief Process Officer or something that would denote those types of responsibilities?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the CPO, the Chief Process Officer, or Chief Process Architect, or Chief Operational Excellence Officer, Chief Business Transformation Officer, those are all similar titles, and we are seeing that happening more and more. And it's an exciting trend and necessary. And yes, the process ownership role and term was created by Dr. Hammer, and there are a lot of implications to it, but we're seeing a wonderful, positive trend.
All right, great. Well, Lisa, we're gonna wrap it up there, and we're right about our 2 o'clock stop. And I wanted to thank all our members for participating in this virtual group meeting, and we look forward to your ongoing participation on Brainstorm Central and within the community. And Lisa Hershman with Hammer and Company, thank you so much for your time, Lisa. We appreciate you coming down and exposing our members to some of the key concepts that have made Hammer and Company such a staple to this community and some of this process thinking for a long time, and sharing some of the concepts of the new book.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and keep up the great work at BPM Institute. I think what you're doing is wonderful, so thank you for having me.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye now.